On a cold evening in March 1943, in his sprawling office overlooking Berlin, Reich Minister Albert Speer sat alone with a stack of intelligence reports. One document caught his eye, a technical assessment from the Abwehr about an American factory called Willow Run. As he read the production projections, one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, his hands began to tremble. Not from disbelief, but from immediate understanding. Speer was different from the fanatics around him. He was an architect turned industrialist who understood numbers, logistics, and brutal mathematical reality. In that moment, doing calculations on a notepad, he arrived at a terrifying conclusion. Germany had already lost the war, but if he uttered a single word of this truth to Adolf Hitler, he would be executed as a defeatist traitor. This is the story of the man who saw the future with perfect clarity and had to spend the next 2 years pretending to believe in a victory he knew was impossible. Albert Speer was an anomaly in Hitler's inner circle. While men like Goebbels, Himmler, and Göring were true believers drunk on Nazi ideology, Speer was something else entirely. A pragmatist, an efficiency expert. A man who saw the war not as a mystical struggle of blood and soil, but as a problem of steel tonnage, coal production, and factory output. He had joined the Nazi Party young, seduced not by anti-Semitism or racial theory, but by ambition and the promise of grand architectural projects. Hitler liked him because Speer delivered results without the political drama. He was competent, loyal, and most importantly, he spoke the language of production that Hitler desperately needed as the war dragged on. In February 1942, after the death of Fritz Todt in a plane crash, Speer was appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. At just 36 years old, he became responsible for the entire German war economy. It was a poisoned chalice. Germany was fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly superior resources. The Soviet Union alone had more people, more land, and more raw materials than Germany could ever hope to match. And then there was America, the sleeping giant that Hitler had foolishly helped awaken by declaring war after Pearl Harbor. Speer knew the grim arithmetic. Modern warfare was industrial warfare. It wasn't about the bravery of soldiers or the genius of generals. It was about who could produce more tanks, more planes, more bullets. And by early 1943, the numbers were starting to look very, very bad. German factories were being bombed. Raw materials were scarce. Synthetic fuel plants couldn't keep up with demand. The Eastern Front was devouring men and equipment at an unsustainable rate. Speer was desperately trying to rationalize production, to squeeze every ounce of efficiency from a system that was being strangled by Nazi corruption and ideological stupidity. And then the Abwehr reports started arriving, intelligence assessments about American industrial capacity. At first, Speer dismissed them like everyone else. The numbers seemed inflated, impossible. But unlike Göring or Hitler, Speer actually did the math. He cross-referenced the data. He consulted with his own industrial experts. And slowly, horrifyingly, he realized the truth. The Americans weren't exaggerating. If anything, they were understating their capabilities. The report on Willow Run was the breaking point. Speer read it multiple times, checking and rechecking the figures. A single American factory applying automobile mass production techniques to a 4-engine heavy bomber. The Ford Motor Company projected to eventually produce one B-24 Liberator every hour, 24 bombers a day, over 700 a month, from one facility. Speer pulled out his production reports for German heavy bombers. The entire Reich, with all its vaunted engineering expertise, all its factories, was struggling to produce a fraction of that number. The Heinkel. He-177, Germany's primary heavy bomber, was a maintenance nightmare plagued by engine fires. Production was maybe 30 or 40 a month across all factories, and half of them were grounded with technical problems. He did the math on his notepad. If Willow Run hit its target, and if the Americans built even 2 or 3 similar facilities, they would be producing more heavy bombers in a month than Germany could produce in a year. And that was just bombers. The reports also detailed American production of fighters, transport aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ships. The numbers were staggering. America was building an industrial avalanche that would bury the Third Reich. But here was the problem. Speer couldn't say any of this out loud. In Hitler's Reich, pessimism was treason. Suggesting that Germany might lose the war was defeatism, punishable by death. The regime had created an atmosphere where reality itself was a dangerous thing to acknowledge. You either believed in final victory with fanatical certainty, or you were an enemy of the state. Speer thought about Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, who had presented these same reports to Göring and been laughed out of the room. He thought about the generals on the Eastern Front, who had warned that Stalingrad was a trap and had been relieved of command for their honesty. The message was clear. Tell Hitler what he wants to hear, or suffer the consequences. So Speer made a choice. He would do his job. He would increase German production as much as physically possible. He would work miracles of efficiency and organization. But he would never, ever tell the Fuhrer the mathematical truth, that they were in a race they had already lost. The next 2 years of Speer's life were a masterclass in calculated deception. In public and in meetings with Hitler, he projected confidence and determination. He spoke of new weapons, increased output, and final victory. He became a master of delivering good news while burying the bad. When Hitler demanded more tanks, Speer found ways to increase tank production, even if it meant cannibalizing resources from other critical areas. When the Fuhrer wanted new wonder weapons, Speer redirected engineers to work on the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, even though he knew they were strategically meaningless. Behind the scenes, Speer was performing a different calculation. He was trying to prolong Germany's ability to defend itself, not because he believed in victory, but because he knew what would happen when the Reich collapsed. Millions of German civilians would be caught in the crossfire. Cities would be destroyed. His only hope was that somehow, some way, a negotiated peace could be reached before total annihilation. But every day, the evidence of American industrial might become harder to ignore. Starting in late 1943, the skies over Germany began to darken with Allied bombers. The B-24 Liberators from Willow Run were now arriving in Europe by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The strategic bombing campaign that Göring had promised would never happen was systematically dismantling German industry. Speer watched his own factories get obliterated, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, aircraft factories in Regensburg, synthetic fuel refineries in Leuna. Every raid proved that the Abwehr reports had been correct. The Americans had built an air armada of impossible scale, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was being systematically destroyed trying to stop it. The most maddening part was watching Göring's continued denial. Even as thousands of American bombers filled the German sky, the Reichsmarschall insisted it was temporary, that the Luftwaffe would soon regain control. He blamed the losses on cowardly pilots, on saboteurs, on anyone but himself. He refused to accept that he had been catastrophically wrong about American capability. Hitler was even worse. In military briefings, he would fly into rages at the mention of American production numbers. He insisted they were Jewish propaganda, inflated lies meant to demoralize the German people. When generals tried to explain the reality of Allied material superiority, Hitler would scream about German willpower, about secret weapons that would turn the tide, about the inevitable fracturing of the Allied coalition. Speer sat through these meetings in silent agony. He knew the truth. The war was lost. Every additional day of fighting was just adding to the final death toll. But to say it was suicide. In February 1944, the full horror of Speer's predictions came true. The Allies launched Operation Argument, which came to be known as Big Week. It was a coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry designed to achieve air superiority once and for all. For 6 days, American and British bombers, many of them B-24 Liberators from Willow Run, pounded aircraft factories across the Reich. Speer watched the reports come in with a sense of grim inevitability. Messerschmitt plants in Augsburg and Regensburg, devastated. Junker's facilities in Bernburg, destroyed. Heinkel factories in Rostock, burning. In less than a week, The Allies flew over 6,000 bomber sorties and dropped 20,000 tons of bombs. The German aircraft industry was shattered. The Luftwaffe rose to defend and was slaughtered. German fighter pilots, however brave and skilled, were simply outnumbered and overwhelmed. For every German fighter that went down, there were no replacements. The training schools couldn't produce pilots fast enough. The factories couldn't produce planes fast enough. Meanwhile, the Americans lost hundreds of aircraft during Big Week, but it didn't matter. For every bomber lost, 3 more were crossing the Atlantic. The production pipeline from factories like Willow Run was endless. After Big Week, Speer knew with absolute certainty that Germany had lost control of its own airspace. From that point forward, Allied bombers could strike anywhere in the Reich with relative impunity. His factories, his fuel plants, his transportation networks, everything was now a target, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In a meeting after Big Week, Hitler demanded to know how aircraft production could be restored. Speer gave him the answer he knew Hitler wanted to hear. More underground factories, more dispersed production, more ingenuity. He didn't say what he was actually thinking, that the German aircraft industry had just been dealt a mortal blow by an industrial system Germany could never hope to match. That the Willow Run report from March 1943 had been a prophecy, and that prophecy had now come true. Throughout 1944, Speer watched the slow-motion collapse of everything he had built. Allied bombing grew more intense, more precise, more devastating. The oil campaign in particular was catastrophic. Starting in May 1944, Allied bombers systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel plants. By September, fuel production had dropped by 90%. Tanks sat immobile for lack of gasoline. Aircraft were grounded. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, could barely fly. Speer tried desperately to keep production going. He moved factories underground into caves and tunnels. He dispersed manufacturing across hundreds of smaller facilities. He used slave labor from concentration camps to replace German workers sent to the front. It was all futile. You can't win an industrial war when the enemy controls the skies and can bomb you at will. The Americans weren't just outproducing Germany. They were producing on a scale that defied comprehension. Speer obtained intelligence reports on total Allied production. The numbers were staggering. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, with all of Speer's efficiency improvements, managed about 40,000. And German planes were increasingly primitive compared to the advanced American designs rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, Seattle, and California. The most bitter irony was that Speer had actually succeeded in increasing German war production throughout 1943 and 1944. Tank production tripled, artillery production doubled. He had worked miracles of organization and efficiency, but it didn't matter. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of Allied material. Every German tank faced 5 or 10 Allied tanks. Every German plane faced 20 Allied planes. The mathematics of industrial warfare were immutable, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. By early 1945, even Hitler's delusions were starting to crack. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were approaching Berlin. There was nowhere left to retreat. And yet, still, Speer couldn't tell the truth. Hitler had issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure to deny it to the Allies. Speer quietly sabotaged these orders, preserving what he could for Germany's future. But in meetings with Hitler, he still played the role of the loyal minister, nodding along to fantasies about wonder weapons and last-minute counteroffensives. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years. Speer was arrested by Allied forces and held for interrogation. And finally, for the first time since March 1943, he could tell the truth. In detailed interrogations with American and British intelligence officers, Speer laid out everything. He described his calculations about Willow Run. He explained how he had known, as early as mid-1943, that the war was mathematically unwinnable. He detailed Hitler's refusal to accept reality, Göring's catastrophic incompetence, and the systemic inability of the Nazi regime to process facts that contradicted ideology. The interrogators pressed him. Why didn't you tell Hitler? Why didn't you try to end the war earlier? Speer's answer was chilling in its honesty. Because I would have been shot, and someone less competent would have taken my place. I believed I could at least minimize the destruction, prolong our defenses long enough for some kind of negotiated end. I was wrong. The Americans took Speer to see American factories. They wanted him to understand the scale of what he had been up against. They showed him the Willow Run plant in Michigan. The enormous room, over half a mile long, where B-24 bombers had rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes at peak production. Speer walked the length of the facility in stunned silence. Later, he told his interrogators, I knew the numbers intellectually, but seeing it, understanding the organization, the efficiency, the scale, it's staggering. We never had a chance, not against this. At the Nuremberg trials, Speer was one of the few Nazi leaders to admit responsibility. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his use of slave labor. He received 20 years in Spandau prison. During his imprisonment, he wrote extensively about his experiences, including his early realization about American industrial capacity. In his memoir, Inside the Third Reich, published after his release in 1966, Speer finally told the full story. He described the moment he read the Willow Run report in March 1943 and understood Germany had lost. He wrote about the surreal experience of spending 2 years pretending to believe in victory while knowing the mathematical reality. He reflected on his moral failure, his complicity in prolonging a war that killed millions. When all the records were compiled after the war, the numbers vindicated everything Speer had feared. Willow Run alone produced 8,685 B-24 Liberators during its operation. The United States manufactured over 18,400 total B-24s, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. In total, from 1940 to 1945, the United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, in the same period, produced approximately 94,000. But it wasn't just aircraft. The Americans outproduced Germany in virtually every category. Tanks, 88,000 American versus 67,000 German. Trucks, 2.4 million American versus 350,000 German. The arsenal of democracy had lived up to its name. It had buried the Third Reich under a mountain of steel. The Willow Run factory, the facility that German leaders had laughed at, that they had dismissed as impossible propaganda, had produced more four-engine heavy bombers by itself than the entire German aircraft industry managed during the whole war. It wasn't even close. Albert Speer, the one man in Hitler's inner circle with the technical knowledge to understand this, had seen it coming in March 1943. He had done the calculations. He had known with absolute certainty that Germany couldn't win an industrial war against America. But he had been trapped in a system where truth was treason, where facts were subordinate to ideology, where reality itself was negotiable. The tragedy of Albert Speer is not that he failed to see the truth. It's that he saw it perfectly and lacked the courage to act on it. He was not a true believer like Goebbels. He was not a delusional fool like Göring. He was an intelligent, rational man who understood mathematics and logistics. And that understanding led him to one inescapable conclusion in March 1943. The war was lost. But Speer made a calculation. He valued his own survival over the potential of shortening the war. He convinced himself that he could mitigate the damage, that his continued competence in managing war production would somehow reduce the final death toll. In reality, his efficiency only prolonged the agony. Every tank he produced meant more soldiers sent to die in a lost cause. Every aircraft that rolled out of his factories meant more bombing raids, more destroyed cities, more civilian casualties. The Willow Run report had been a test, not of German intelligence gathering, which functioned perfectly, but of the Nazi leadership's ability to accept reality. They failed that test catastrophically. Canaris brought them the truth and was dismissed. Speer calculated the truth and remained silent. Hitler and Göring denied the truth and doomed millions. The story of Albert Speer and Willow Run is a stark reminder that intelligence without courage is worthless. That understanding reality is meaningless if you lack the moral strength to act on it. Speer spent the rest of his life trying to present himself as the good Nazi, the technocrat who was just following orders, the pragmatist trapped in an impossible situation. But the truth is simpler and more damning. In March 1943, one man in Hitler's inner circle possessed the knowledge and credibility to potentially change the course of the war, to force a confrontation with reality, to maybe, just maybe, save hundreds of thousands of lives by acknowledging the mathematical impossibility of German victory. That man was Albert Speer, and he chose silence. The bombers kept rolling off the Willow Run assembly line, one every 63 minutes, an avalanche of American steel that buried the Third Reich and validated every calculation Speer had made and never spoken aloud. If you found this story fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell. History is full of moments like this, where a single decision, a single silence, changed everything. The story of Speer and Willow Run shows us that sometimes the most catastrophic failures aren't failures of intelligence or strategy. They're failures of courage, the inability to speak truth to power, even when millions of lives hang in the balance. Monte Cassino, Italy, May 11, 1944. 5 o'clock a.m. for Obergefreiter Hans Schneider of the 1st Parachute Regiment. That morning began with an unnatural silence. After months of incessant bombardment, silence was more terrifying than the roar of bombs. It meant something was about to happen. From his position among the ruins of what had once been a Benedictine monastery, his tired eyes scanned the Liri Valley. But what caught his eye, what chilled him to the bone, was the metal, an iron carpet extending to the horizon. This wasn't a formation, it was a mathematical equation. This is the story of the elite soldier who realized that courage was irrelevant against the industrial might of a continent, and how the brutal arithmetic of Allied production sealed the fate of the war on the forgotten hills of Italy. Schneider was 24 years old, but his eyes belonged to a much older man. They were eyes that had seen Crete, the Russian front, and now this cursed hill in Italy that the Allies simply called Cassino. From his position among the ruins of what had once been a Benedictine monastery, he looked south through the dust still hanging in the air. The Liri Valley stretched before him like a table set for a banquet of death. He could see the Allied lines, fields dotted with bomb craters, the Gari and Rapido rivers glittering in the early morning light. But what caught his eye, what froze his spirit, was the metal. Tanks. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of tanks. They weren't deployed in attack formation. Not yet. They were simply there, laid out across the valley like an iron carpet extending to the horizon. Shermans, Churchills, even the massive Grants. Schneider knew their silhouettes by heart after months of fighting. He had learned to read them like a farmer reads clouds. The low, sloping profile of a Sherman meant American forces. The boxy, angular shape of a Churchill meant British. Each silhouette told a story of which division, which corps, which nation was preparing to climb his hill. Beside him, young Gefreiter Müller, barely 17 years old, whispered in a trembling voice, "My God, how many are there?" Schneider didn't answer immediately. He was doing the calculations, a veteran's habit. During the first assault in January, he had counted about 200 tanks. During the second in February, perhaps 300. During the third in March, it had seemed impossible, nearly 500. But this was different. "More than 1,000, he finally said, his voice flat. "Maybe 1,500. Muller looked at him with wide eyes, incredulous. But how is that possible? Where did they get them all?" Schneider smiled bitterly. It was a question he had been asking himself for months. A question that haunted him in the cold hours before dawn, when the shelling paused and the mind had nothing to do but calculate its own doom. Every German tank destroyed was an irreplaceable loss. Every Panzer IV or Tiger that was hit represented weeks of production, precious resources diverted from other fronts. Schneider had seen it with his own eyes. A Tiger tank knocked out in February still sat abandoned in the valley below. Too difficult to recover, too expensive to replace. It had become a landmark, a monument to German limitations. But the Allies, they simply brought more, always more. He had heard the rumors. An intelligence officer had spoken about the numbers during a briefing weeks earlier, his voice shaken, almost disbelieving his own words. The Americans alone were producing one tank every 7 minutes. Every 7 minutes. Schneider had done the math in his head during the long sleepless nights among the rubble. It meant more than 200 tanks per day, thousands per week, tens of thousands per month. Germany, at its peak production, could barely build 2,000 or 3,000 tanks in an entire month. And that was before the factories started burning under Allied bombing raids. Now, with the industrial heartland of the Ruhr under constant attack, production had slowed to a trickle. This wasn't a battle, it was a mathematical equation, and the result had been calculated long before he arrived on this hill. The only variable was time, how long until the numbers overwhelmed them completely. He thought of his training, years ago, when instructors had drilled into them the importance of initiative, of tactical brilliance, of the superior German soldier. They had been told that one German was worth 10 enemies. Perhaps that had been true in Poland, in France, even in the early days of Russia. But here, now, even if it were true, even if every German paratrooper was worth 10 Allied soldiers, the mathematics still didn't work. Because the Allies didn't need to be better, they just needed to be more. He looked at the rubble around him. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, a jewel of medieval architecture that had stood for 1,500 years, had been reduced to dust in a few hours of bombardment. The Allies were convinced the Germans had fortified it. Schneider knew it was a German propaganda lie that had worked too well. Field Marshal Kesselring had declared the abbey a protected zone. No German soldier had set foot in it until the bombardment. The paratroopers had respected that order, setting up their positions in the town below and in the hills around it. But when the Allies destroyed it on February 15th, transforming it into a sea of ruins, the German paratroopers moved in immediately. The rubble provided better cover than any intact building. The massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, had tumbled into defensive positions, better than any engineer could have designed. Irony of war, the Allies had created the fortress they feared, but even that fortress was crumbling. Schneider looked toward Monte Cassino, or what was left of it. The hill itself seemed lower than it had been in January. Tons of explosives had literally leveled it. Bomb craters overlapped one another, creating a lunar landscape of churned earth and shattered stone. Every tree had been snapped, every building pulverized. Even the dead couldn't rest in peace. Corpses emerged from the rubble with each new bombardment, only to be buried again by the next. Schneider had stopped trying to identify them. German, Allied, civilian. They all looked the same after weeks under the earth. The smell never left. Even in winter, even in the cold mountain air, the stench of decay hung over everything. It had seeped into his uniform, his equipment, his skin. He wondered if he would ever be able to wash it away, or if he would carry it with him forever, however long forever might be. Mueller shifted beside him, nervous energy radiating from his young body. The boy had arrived just 3 weeks ago, fresh from training, full of the propaganda about the invincible Fallschirmjäger. Schneider had seen that look before. He had worn it himself once, a lifetime ago in Crete. Obergefreiter, Mueller said quietly, do you think we can hold? It was the question every young soldier asked, and every veteran had to decide. Tell the truth and break their spirit, or lie and let them keep their illusions a little longer. Schneider chose a middle path. We've held before. 3 times. But this time seems different. Every time seems different. Schneider kept his binoculars trained on the valley, and every time they've had more than the last. He didn't tell Müller what he was really thinking, that holding didn't matter anymore. They had held in January, and the Allies came back in February. They had held in February, and the Allies came back in March. They had held in March, and now here they were in May, and the Allies had returned with even more. Holding was just delaying. The only question was how long, and at what cost. It was 11 o'clock when it began. Even before he heard the sound, Schneider felt the vibration through the stone beneath him. A deep, primordial tremor, as if the earth itself were screaming. Then came the roar. 2,000 Allied guns opening fire simultaneously. Operation Diadem, the fourth and final assault on Casino. The sky darkened, not from clouds, but from the sheer volume of metal crossing it. Schneider threw himself behind a block of stone that had once been part of the abbey wall. Müller was beside him, reciting a prayer under his breath that was lost in the din. The explosions had no end. One overlapped another, creating a single, continuous artificial earthquake. Dust rose in clouds so dense the sun disappeared. The world became a gray twilight, lit only by the orange flashes of explosions. Breathing became agony. Each breath brought with it particles of stone and cordite. Schneider pulled his scarf over his mouth and nose, but it did little good. His lungs burned. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that he knew would never fully go away. He had been through artillery barrages before. In Russia, he had endured Soviet bombardments that had seemed endless. But this was different. This wasn't just artillery. This was a statement. This was the Allies demonstrating, with brutal clarity, exactly how much material they could afford to waste on a single objective. Schneider closed his eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3. At 10, he lost count. The explosions were too close together, too numerous. It was like trying to count raindrops during a hurricane. He thought about the guns. 2,000 artillery pieces. Where did they come from? Who produced them? Who supplied the millions of shells raining down on his position? The answer was obvious, but unbearable. Factories in America, in Great Britain, in Canada, throughout the British Empire. Factories working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in places no German bomber would ever reach. Factories that could outproduce the entire German war economy, while simultaneously building ships, planes, trucks, and everything else the Allies needed. He had seen an intelligence report once, passed around among the officers with grim fascination. It estimated that American industrial output alone was larger than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. And that was before counting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and all the other Allied nations. Germany was fighting not just armies, but entire continents of industrial production. The bombardment lasted an eternity. When it finally subsided, Schneider emerged from his shelter and looked around. His position was still intact, miraculously. But everything around him had changed. Landmarks he knew had disappeared. A distinctive pile of rubble that had served as a reference point was gone, flattened into the surrounding moonscape. Trenches he had personally dug had been erased, filled in by the displaced earth from nearby explosions. He heard voices in the distance. Müller was alive, curled in a ball against the stone, his hands still pressed over his ears, even though the shelling had stopped. Feldwebel Koch was also shouting orders from somewhere to his left. The paratroopers had survived. Again. The first Shermans reached the outer lines at 2 p.m. Schneider heard the crackle of German machine guns, the hiss of Panzerfausts, the explosions. He saw black smoke rising from the valley, Allied tanks on fire. His comrades were fighting, but the tanks kept advancing. A tank caught fire, 2 bypassed it. An anti-tank position destroyed 3 Shermans. 5 circled the position and eliminated it with direct hits. It was like trying to stop the sea with your hands. Schneider watched through his binoculars as a German MG-42 position opened fire on advancing infantry. The gun was perfectly sighted, in a bunker that had survived the bombardment, with an excellent field of fire. The gunner was good, experienced, firing in short, controlled bursts. The Allied infantry went to ground, pinned down. For a moment, it seemed like the old rules still applied. a well-positioned machine gun, could still dominate a battlefield. Then a Sherman tank simply drove up to the bunker and fired a high-explosive round directly into the firing slit at point-blank range. The MG-42 went silent. The tank moved on. The infantry advanced. Problem identified. Problem solved. Next problem. It was that casual efficiency that chilled Schneider to his core. They weren't even angry about the machine gun. It was just an obstacle to be removed, like clearing a fallen tree from a road. It was then that Schneider had an idea. He called Obergefreiter Keller, the company's best marksman, a silent veteran of 32 who had served in North Africa and Russia, a man who could hit a coin at 400 meters. See that ridge? Schneider pointed to a spot where Allied infantry were advancing behind the tanks. The officers will be there. Stop them. Keller nodded, took his Kar 98K with Zeiss optics, and positioned himself between two blocks of stone. Schneider watched him work through his binoculars. It was pure art. The first shot, an American captain collapsed. The second, a lieutenant who was shouting orders. The third, a sergeant with a radio on his back. For one glorious moment, the enemy advance stopped. Confusion spread through their ranks. Men threw themselves to the ground seeking cover. Schneider felt a wave of professional pride. This was what the Fallschirmjäger did best. Individual skill, deadly precision, one man worth 100. Perhaps, he thought for one insane moment, perhaps courage and training could still make a difference. Perhaps the old virtues, marksmanship, tactical cunning, the warrior spirit, still mattered. Then came the Allied response. It wasn't a sniper in retaliation. It wasn't a bombardment. It was something Schneider had never seen before. A bulldozer. A massive armored D8 bulldozer, painted dull olive green, rumbled forward toward Keller's position. The front blade had been reinforced with steel plates. It pushed before it a wall of earth, rock and rubble 2 meters high. Keller fired at it. Schneider saw the spray of sparks where the bullet hit the steel. But the bulldozer didn't even slow down. It approached Keller's position with the inexorable determination of a machine that knows no fear, feels no pain, has no morale to break. "Keller, move!" Schneider shouted, but his voice was lost in the din. Keller understood. He launched himself out of his position just as the bulldozer reached it. The machine didn't stop. It simply erased the position, burying it under tons of earth and stone. Then it continued advancing, creating an instant embankment behind which the Allied infantry could take cover. Schneider stared at the scene, feeling something break inside him. Not fear, something deeper. His best marksman, a veteran of 3 campaigns, a master of his craft, had been rendered irrelevant by a piece of heavy machinery operated by someone who had probably never fired a shot in his life. The war was no longer man against man, skill against skill. It was man against machine tool. The Allies weren't trying to outsmart him. They weren't even trying to fight him. They were simply reshaping the battlefield itself, moving earth, building roads, burying obstacles. They were applying industrial engineering solutions to military problems. And against this, against 1,000 bulldozers and 10,000 engineers and 100,000 tons of steel, what could a sniper's courage do? Keller reached Schneider's position, covered in dust, his eyes still full of shock. "What was that thing?" he muttered. Schneider didn't answer. He was watching the valley where other bulldozers were at work, accompanied by mobile cranes, trucks loaded with prefabricated bridges, engineer units working with the calm efficiency of workers in a factory. It was at that moment he truly understood. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an industrial civilization. The Allies had brought their factories to the battlefield. Every problem had a mechanical solution. Bunker too strong? Drive a bulldozer over it. River in the way? Bring a prefabricated bridge. Hill too steep? Build a road. Mines in the field? Bring a flail tank. The Germans had spent years mastering the art of war. The Allies had industrialized it. From his elevated position, Schneider had a perfect view of the assault. And as he watched, he saw something he would never forget. He saw the exact moment when the German line broke. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screams or panicked retreats. Simply positions stopped firing one after another, silenced by the pure volume of fire that hit them. And the tanks kept advancing, filling every breach, surrounding every strong point, inexorable as the tide. A position on the left flank went silent first. Schneider had known the men there. Good soldiers, veterans. They had simply been overwhelmed, buried under fire from tanks, artillery, and infantry all at once. Then a position to the right, then another behind that. Like dominoes falling, each position isolated and eliminated in turn. Schneider realized with cold clarity that this was the plan. The Allies weren't trying for a dramatic breakthrough. They were systematically dismantling the defense, position by position, using overwhelming firepower to eliminate each strong point before moving to the next. It was methodical, it was efficient, it was unstoppable. That night, Schneider and the survivors of his unit received the order to withdraw. Cassino would fall, not because the German paratroopers hadn't fought hard enough, but because mathematics never lied. As he retreated through the ruins, Schneider looked back one last time. The hill they had defended for 4 months, where thousands of men had died on both sides, was finally lost. Not for lack of courage, not for tactical errors. It was lost because on the other side was an enemy who could afford to lose 10 tanks for every German tank destroyed. An enemy who could fire 100 shells for every German shell. An enemy whose factories produced in one day what Germany produced in a month. The moon was rising over the valley, illuminating the scene with cold silver light. He could see the Allied positions spreading across the landscape like a disease, consuming everything. Headlights from trucks, fires from cooking stoves, the glow of welding torches as engineers worked through the night to prepare for the next day's advance. They never stopped. That was the thing that struck him most. Even at night, even after a full day of combat, the Allied war machine kept running. Supplies flowing forward, casualties flowing back, replacements arriving, equipment being repaired. The German army stopped at night. It had to. There wasn't enough fuel, enough ammunition, enough of anything to maintain constant operations. But the Allies? They had enough for everything. He had understood what many Germans would only understand much later, when Sherman tanks would cross the Rhine and German factories would be reduced to ash. This war would not be won or lost on the battlefields. It had already been decided in the factories, in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in the shipyards of Glasgow, in the workshops of Detroit and Birmingham and Toronto. Germany had built an army of warriors. The Allies had built a machine, and machines never tire, never fear, never surrender. Schneider thought of the training he had received, the pride in the Fallschirmjäger tradition, the belief in German superiority. All of it had been real, in a way. The German soldier was probably better trained, more experienced, more tactically proficient than his Allied counterpart. But none of it mattered. Because while Germany was creating elite soldiers, the Allies were creating an industrial system that could bury those elite soldiers under an avalanche of materiel. Quality didn't matter when quantity was infinite. He thought of his own journey, Crete, where the paratroopers had won at terrible cost, Russia, where they had fought to a standstill, and now Italy, where they were slowly being ground down by sheer weight of resources. Each campaign had been harder than the last, not because the enemy was better, but because there were more of them, and more tanks, and more planes, and more guns, and more of everything. As he walked away from Cassino in the night, Schneider knew one thing with absolute certainty. The war was over. All that remained was to count the dead and measure the rubble. And in the heart of the Italian night, in a war that would continue for another 12 agonizing months, a German paratrooper had seen the truth that his leaders refused to admit. They weren't fighting other soldiers. They were fighting the entire crushing weight of the modern industrial world, and there had never been any chance of victory. The war would go on, of course. Men would keep fighting, keep dying, keep following orders. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. It had been determined not by courage or skill or tactical brilliance, but by production capacity, by gross domestic product, by the simple, brutal mathematics of industrial output. Germany had gambled that willpower and military excellence could overcome material disadvantage, that the spirit of the warrior could triumph over the factory, that one superior German soldier could defeat 10 inferior enemies. It was a romantic notion, and it was completely, catastrophically wrong. The modern world wasn't won by heroes, it was won by production lines. The Battle of Cassino lasted from January to May 1944. It cost the Allies approximately 55,000 casualties and the Germans about 20,000. But while the Germans could not replace their losses, the Allies could. And they did, again and again, until the end. Monte Cassino fell on May 18, 1944. The ruins of the abbey, fought over for 4 months, were finally secured by Polish forces. The road to Rome was open. But for Obergefreiter Hans Schneider, the real end had come earlier, in that moment when he watched a bulldozer bury his best sniper. That was when he understood that the war he thought he was fighting, a war of soldiers and tactics and courage, had never really existed. The real war was being fought in factories thousands of miles away, and that war had been lost long before he ever reached Cassino.